Hello, everybody. Bienvenidos. Welcome to the 2023 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. It's my absolute honor to be here. My name is Aida Salazar, and I am going to be moderating today's panel. Well, not even a panel, it's a spotlight on the power of poetry and our dear maestra of all maestras, Margarita Engle. But before we start, I'm going to ask that you please read the anti-harassment policy in the chat box. And don't forget to just subscribe to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival YouTube channel. And if you're a school or a classroom or a librarian or educator joining us, our school visit fund is back. You can enter to win a free virtual visit from a Latinx author or illustrator for your classroom or library. So if you want, you can find the link to the entry form in the chat. All right, so let's get this party started. Again, it's an honor for me to be here with La Gran Maestra Margarita Engle. Margarita Engle is the Cuban-American author of many verse novels, memoirs, and picture books, including The Surrender Tree, Enchanted Air, Drum Dream Girl, and Dancing Hands. Awards which are so awesome and among the highest that we can receive in children's literature. They include a Newbery Honor, the Pura Belpré, the Golden Kite, the Walter, Jane Addams, Penn USA, and the NSK Newsdat, among others. Margarita has served as the National 2017 to 2019 Young People's Poet Laureate. Her most recent books are Wings in the Wild and Destiny Finds Her Way. Her next young adult verse novel is Wild Dreamers, and her next picture book is Water Day. Bienvenida, Margarita. Felicidades.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. So it's so exciting to be here.
Well, I have a slew of questions for you that, and we'll just jump right in. You, as I just read, are one of the most prolific and pioneering verse novelists in children's literature, and certainly in our community, but in the broader sense of children's literature. My question to you is, how did you learn to write verse novels?
Thank you. It's funny to hear the word prolific, because it means like I write so much and publish so much, but actually I just write every day, every morning. And I think that I learn by taking those mornings and experimenting, exploring. I think that there's no one right way to write poetry, and definitely no one right way to write a verse novel. Because you might have just one voice, or there may be many voices. In the case of Enchanted Air, my memoir, El Encantado, it's just my one voice because it's a memoir, so it's different than the fictional verse novels. I didn't have to do any research. It was just remembering. But remembering can be a hard thing to face. Memories can be emotional. Fiction can be emotional too. But I think that really experimenting, exploring is the key to writing. To not have a set idea of where I'm going when I start, even though I know my subject, even though I may know the ending of the story, I don't know the whole middle. In most cases, even with research, even with true events, I don't always know the whole middle, because it's an emotional exploration. It's not just facts. And then it's a musical exploration, because the poetry is music. So you try one rhythm. I write mostly in free verse, but there's still rhythm even when there's not rhyme. And then I'm using so many poetic devices within free verse that I like to experiment with and see how it sounds and see how it feels. For me, it's really very much about the feelings, the emotions.
Mm-hmm. So did that just come naturally to you, or did you study poetry? How did poetry kind of manifest as your primary form?
My mother read to me a lot when I was little, and she was learning English in California, newly arrived from Cuba, and
Mhm.
she would read Los Versos Sencillos de José Martí to me, which are metered and rhymed poems. And when I walked to school, I would kind of compose to the rhythm of my footsteps.
Mhm.
And I didn't usually write them down, but it was like, to me, it was a form of internal, it's something intuitive that I was already experimenting, at that very young age. Now, then I studied sciences. I studied botany and agronomy, and I became the first woman agronomy professor at one of California's polytechnic universities. So I was writing scientific things and technical things, poetry on the side, um, from my own happiness, because poetry makes me happy.
Yeah.
If you take only one thing away today,
Uh-huh.
to all the students out there, that's what I'd like to say is poetry makes me happy, and um, you don't have to publish it. You don't have to try and get famous. You can just write it for your own joy, and you
Mhm.
can just read it for your own joy.
So
And then eventually I came back to poetry full time after writing a lot of scientific things and writing prose novels for adults. And I
mm,
find that I'm happiest when I'm writing verse for younger readers.
mm, yeah. Well,
Um,
but what is it? What is it about poetry specifically that makes it so powerfully different from anything that any other form of writing? Like, what can you kind of describe for you what is it?
I think the musical nature of poetry is part of it. We enjoy music and we can enjoy poetry. I
Mm,
I don't think that we need to analyze poetry. I don't think that a teacher needs to ask students, what did the poem mean? Because there's no one right answer to that question.
mm,
I would much rather hear the question, how did the poem make you feel? And every person will have a different answer to that one. And in fact, the poet herself will have a different answer on different days, depending on experience and mood and so forth. But so the music is part of it, the emotions is part of it. I also think that it's a unique combination of personal and communal. I
mm,
think that it's interactive, that when I write a poem, you can open any of my books to any page and write a poem and answer to me. Whether you agree with me or disagree with me, you can do your own exploration.
mm,
And I think that it's a very ancient form. When I picture how would our storytelling have been thousands of years ago, what did our ancestors do? Didn't they sit around the cooking fire and do their storytelling in rhythm and in music and in verse, whether they had an instrument playing or not, whether they were singing or not? Didn't they kind of throw their emotions into their storytelling and throw that music in there?
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I often my husband's a musician, and so sometimes, I mean, he I've heard him say that the first rhythm that we ever heard was our mother's heartbeat. I think that kind of translates, like it allows us to kind of enter anything rhythmic, anything poetic, anything musical in a really wonderful way. So I appreciate that answer, because I had never. I mean, I'm working on we're working on an anthology called "Sing Me a Story" that's coming out next year. So that like is really kind of behind that that idea, right?
Mhm.
That there's an inherent music inside of poetry. I love
Yeah, and I think that for a teacher, for a classroom, sometimes stepping outside of the walls helps because of the rhythm of the footsteps that I mentioned. Sometimes
Mhm.
going for a walk, being outdoors, you hear wing beats, you hear other rhythms. Sometimes that's all it takes to
Mhm.
uh, to have the poem feel like part of nature.
Mhm. Beautiful. So the verse novel is a hybrid form, and it's hard to define, as you said. It's hard to put your uh, because so many different people write it differently, and there's no one right way. But for you, how can you describe what a verse novel is, and what draws you to the form, and like where you draw your inspiration? I imagine just by reading you, yeah, and what you've said, that it's nature. But can you just elaborate a little more about verse novel and where you draw your inspiration?
When I started writing verse novels in the early 2000s, um, it was a new form to me. I had only read a few, and there really are still, in the US at this point, very few written for adults. There are many now for young readers. And surprisingly, in Australia, there are a lot of verse novels for adults. So it depends on where you are and which books are available. But there were very few available to me when I was starting. The ones that were, such as Marilyn Nelson's Carver, really had a powerful influence on me. And I treasured, I fell in love with the format, and I still treasure the format, and I enjoy it so much. I enjoy reading verse novels, I enjoy writing verse novels. As far as defining, I don't set any rules for myself. Like I don't think it has to be a certain length or a certain word count. Uh, Whether it's one voice or many voices depends on the story, because it is still storytelling. It's an unusual combination of music and storytelling, of poetry and storytelling.
Mhm.
And whether it's fiction or whether it's historical, factual, or memoir, I still feel like the most important thing in the verse novel is the open spaces. I feel like the spaces between stanzas and between poems and where the line breaks are really helps to not just set the rhythm and the sound, but also the emotional impact. What I'm looking for as I go along is a resonance that's like what you hear after you ring a bell or a gong. Think of something really powerful, a gong, that resonance afterwards. You continue to hear a vibration. And I feel like those white spaces, open spaces, I don't like to call them empty spaces. Some people say they're empty, but they're not empty. They're filled with the emotions of the poet and the emotions of the reader. Those open spaces are interactive. That's where we meet in midair and we communicate with each other. And no matter what else it is, no matter how personal, my writing is for me, I'm still trying to communicate. That is my goal, is to, you want the book to be read. And I could say that the author wants to be understood, but each person will understand it in a different way, so I can't control that. What I can do is leave the open space to kind of a very brief pause as you're reading to feel what is happening. I write generally in first person and present tense, and that's deliberate. It's to invite the reader to time travel with me to the particular, if it's a different century or if it's now, to a time and place, and see how does it feel? How does the story feel? How does the character feel in their life? That might be very different from one's own life.
Yeah, I often think of it as like a breath. You know, I often follow a lot of white space after I've written something very intense, just to give people a moment to digest it, to breathe with it, and just like you said, have that gong moment, that quiet, like contemplative space that like allows them to take a breath.
Yeah, and it creates kind of a refuge too.
Mm-hmm.
No, even when it's an upsetting, horrible historical event that you might be writing about,
Yeah.
you want some solace in the form of a source of hope and joy,
Mm-hmm.
and breath would be a good word for that.
Mm-hmm.
Breathing is hope.
Yes.
But, but I also think that in order to achieve what we're talking about, we need to think really carefully about what we leave out. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, in a very detailed historical novel that you've researched so thoroughly and you've memorized all these facts yourself, do you really want to include every single one of those details? Or do you want to keep it somewhat, I'm not going to say simplified, but distilled, intensified,
Mm-hmm.
just deciding to put in what you feel is the most important
Right.
events. For instance, when I write historical novels, I tend to focus on average people rather than the famous people. I don't feel like when I wrote The Surrender Tree about Cuba's 3 wars for independence from Spain, I didn't want to focus as much on the generals as on the children. I wanted to know, what it was like for a child at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the women, what was it like for the women who were healing wounds instead of fighting?
Right. And so, so you wouldn't say that you have like a particular philosophy or a methodology. Seems like it's just it kind of depends on where
I don't feel like I've ever reached a point where I could say I know what I'm doing. I'm always exploring. I'm always learning,
right.
and there's a joy in that. It's also
Mhm.
scary
Yeah,
to never know what you're doing. You're always trying hard.
yeah. But it's very daring too, right? To use this form to kind of like to take risks and do new things. I mean, have you ever felt like anything that you've attempted didn't work in any of your verse novels?
Oh yes, and I've started over so many times. And it's often better for me to start over than to try and correct,
Hmm.
change something that wasn't working. And I love to do my first drafts handwritten, pen
Mm,
and paper. So every time I start over, instead of trying to go in and edit, on the computer, I go back to a handwritten
mhm.
draft
Oh,
again.
right. Okay.
And there I feel, in using a pen and paper, I feel greater freedom
Mhm. Yeah.
because there's a flow,
Mm.
and because when it's just me and the blank page and that pen anything is possible. I haven't created my difficulties yet. You know, I haven't painted myself into a corner where I have to then go say, oh no, now what happens next?
Mhm.
So those kinds of things at that stage, in the early stages when you're really experimenting, offer a lot of freedom.
Mhm.
It does offer challenges too. And for the first 10 years that I was writing verse novels, one of the greatest challenges was that librarians and educators would walk up to me at conferences and say, I don't like poetry.
Yeah,
And,
I've gotten that too.
and I just want to beg them not to say that to their students, because it's misleading to tell students that, but they would say poetry is hard to understand. That's not true. It's just not true. The poetry that's being written now by us is not hard to understand. We're very straightforward. They were taught by, you know, professors using 20th century poems that were deliberately made difficult to understand, often, you know, written for adults and written for the academic environment. And that's not what we're offering to young readers now. So I just hope that people don't keep saying that, because it's sort of like a contagious disease where then the young person will go through their life thinking poetry is hard to understand. And it's like they caught that misunderstanding from adults. So I would hope that people don't go into it with that assumption. But that for me was one of the greatest challenges for many years.
So verse novels are unique, right? So they have, you have to draw from both the poetic and the narrative techniques. How do you decide which tools to use?
I keep saying this, I'm repeating myself, but I explore. I try this, I try that, see how it feels, see how it sounds, try to find a balance.
Let me close my door because I'm hearing a lot of noise. Can you hear that? Can you hear that noise?
No, I don't hear it.
Okay, good. Then I'll just keep going. Sorry.
If you hear a dog barking, that's from this.
That's you? Okay. Okay.
So far, she's been good.
All right. So you're really known for your ability to write in verse using multiple POVs, multiple perspectives. In your most recent book, Wings in the Wild, a young adult love story in verse, your protagonists are a teen girl and a teen boy. What choices did you make as a poet to give each character a poetic language of their own?
In this, yes, Wings in the Wild is the story of, it starts in Cuba, continues in California, meets in Costa Rica. It's actually several interwoven stories, but basically an environmental theme and a love story. And because I was writing first from the girls' point of view and then from the boys, and then they're together, they finally meet, I wrote those imagining what it feels like. The girl comes from Cuba, where her parents are persecuted artists, censored artists, and she wants to be an artist. And so I went into that with the emotions of the protests, the real life protests from a couple of years ago, where many censored artists and writers in Cuba were being arrested for protesting against censorship of art and writing. And they were given very long sentences. So this is not the kind of thing that I've done before. I've usually stayed away from taking sides in current politics. But in that case, the issue of censorship and the need for freedom of expression that I feel is so important to me as a poet, as a writer, I did want to write about that. It's also about climate refugees, and it's about the hundreds of thousands of people who continue to walk every year from Cuba. They fly to South or Central America now and walk towards the US border to be reunited with relatives here. They used to be able to come other ways, but at this point, that's one of the few ways, if they're on a raft, they're going to be intercepted by the Coast Guard and deported. So walking is now basically the only way they can get into the US to be reunited with their families, which is a great tragedy. But I put the emotions of that girl from that background together with the boy who's well off and from California, Cuban American, but a completely different background, and yet fleeing also from the fires that we had in California a couple of years ago that were just, terrifying. And when they meet and fall in love, they figure out ways to rescue wildlife. They figure out ways to have climate action goals. Costa Rica was a good place for that in terms of the true story, because everything that I said about the wildlife rescue there is true, and the rewilding, the release of macaws. And one reason I chose macaws for that, there's so many kinds of wildlife that I could have used, is that macaws mate for life. And so to me, it fit with the love story. My reason for writing an environmental love story is that I'm, as a botanist, as an agronomist, as a scientist, I'm really concerned with the climate crisis and a lot of other environmental issues. But no matter how scary things are, no matter how bad things get, whatever crises people have faced throughout history, we always fall in love. And there's always a love story. And so for me, that's hope. Young people caring about the future and young people caring about each other is a story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, there's such a relationship between poetry and love, right? Many of us write, the only times that many of us write poetry, it's with love. So it makes sense that they would come together in that way.
I'd say love and anger are two.
Love and anger. That's
I mean, poetry is a safe place to put your anger.
That's
and
true.
So when it comes to a topic like the climate crisis, poetry is a place to put my anger. And I would invite teenagers in particular, if you are mad at the older generation, put it in a poem. We'll read it.
Can you speak a little bit? You touched a little bit about metaphor. How do you use metaphor in kind of a broader spectrum? Like you talked about the macaw and its symbolism, and how do you draw out metaphor in your work?
I think that metaphors have to kind of occur naturally. They have to kind of settle over me and then come out through my pen. It has to be something that I've felt myself. Because the memoir Enchanted Air was used by some of the classes. For instance, on page 11, I happen to pick up the English edition, where I say at the end of the poem, "No Place on the Map," which is about wanting a sense of belonging between the two countries, Cuba and the US, when I was a child. I end it with, "Sometimes I feel like a bridge or a storm." That isn't something that I consciously looked for the right metaphor. I just, and I'm not even going to say I thought about what is it like to be between two countries. I felt what it is like to be between two countries. You know, my ability to travel back and forth to Cuba as a younger child before travel restrictions were imposed by both countries was so important in my life, and it helped me bridge, the two parts of my family, get to know the extended family, fall in love with Cuba, with tropical nature, which is why I became a botanist. But the imposition of travel restrictions and the dividing of the family through things that shouldn't affect ordinary people, but do whenever countries get mad at each other, you know, even when it's not war. This was a Cold War. Even when it's not an actual war, those things make me feel like a storm. And when we turn on the news now and we see countries fighting with each other or just bickering with each other or restricting travel or restricting immigration, doing power plays against each other, does it make us angry? Do we feel like a storm? But I want my entire body of work to be devoted to peacemakers ultimately. And so I'm always looking for the bridge. I feel like a storm, but I'm always looking for the bridge.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, you know what I was thinking about? Have you ever created a poem with all of your book titles? Because your book titles are so amazing. They're so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
It would be interesting to.
I'm going to do that. Yes, that's my project now. I love that.
I can't wait to see it.
I love that, and I've been so fortunate to have wonderful illustrators. I love the cover of my memoir, and that's Aida Rodriguez, and he has a graphic memoir coming out of his own about his Marielito background, the Mariel boat lift. So I'm real excited. It's coming out in a month. I'm real excited about reading that. But I thought this was just the perfect cover for this book, and so unique. And then I've been fortunate to have a wonderful the artists working on the recent covers, Wings in the Wild, and my next one, Wild Dreamers, which is a companion book, are both done by Gabi Alessandro. And they're just these incredible covers. And then the picture books have had amazing illustrators, Rafael Lopez for Drum Dream Girl and Dancing Hands, and then Waterday, somebody completely new. It was her first picture book, Olivia Sua, and she did that. Waterday is all cut paper, painted cut paper. So these illustrators that I get to work with are doing these unique things too. So yeah, wow. I love your idea of poem made of titles.
Yeah, and then maybe make a collage of all of your beautiful covers. It would be so pretty to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, because you use a lot of alliteration and internal rhyme, even in your titles.
I do use a lot of internal rhyme and alliteration. I do love similes and metaphors when appropriate. I mean, we don't want to overdo it, but some of that. I especially love vowel rhymes. They're one of my
Mm.
favorite. They're one of my favorite poetic devices, and the technical term assonance is very ugly, so I
Mm.
like to call them vowel rhymes.
That's all right. Um, you spoke a little bit about how a teacher came to you and said, or when teachers come to you and say, "I don't like poetry," and that kind of hurts you. What is the biggest misconception about it? Like, what would you like to dispel about poetry that, or verse novels that?
Well, I think I'll be repeating myself because I did say that I want to emphasize this, that I don't think adults should be telling children and teenagers that poetry is hard to understand. I think that's misleading. And I think that comes from them from their own suffering, from their own education where they were told that they had to analyze these poems that were written a long time ago, and they had to analyze them in a very academic way, where they were led to believe that there was only one right answer.
Mhm.
What does this poem mean? Um, I believe that's false. There's not one right answer. I think how does this poem make you feel is all you need to ask yourself for,
Mhm.
and that sets you free to enjoy poetry.
Mhm.
I mean, imagine if you're listening to radio, now your husband being a professional musician
Mhm.
would listen very differently, of course, but for me, if I'm listening to the radio and enjoying the music, do I need to interrupt that enjoyment by challenging myself to say, what does this song mean?
Mhm. Yeah.
No,
Well,
I don't. I can just enjoy it.
mhm.
And I think we can do the same thing with poetry. I think it's a wonderful refuge for our emotions, both the poet and the reader.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think that we don't need to be uh, negative about it. Look for the positive in poetry.
Mhm.
Find poems um, that the students can enjoy and let them enjoy it.
Haven't you found that some of your students, or some of your readers are gravitated to poetry or novels in verse because of all of the things that you just talked about, because it's fun, because it's different from prose, and
Yeah, and I also think that there are many students out there who are very busy and have a lot of homework, and when they see all that white space, they might say, "Oh, I can do this." It doesn't take
exactly.
that long, and hopefully they'll enjoy reading it. But
Mhm.
also, they often are writing poems of their own
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
their teachers don't know about, that their parents don't know about. Two of the most wonderful things that have happened to me, uh, specific incidents, were when I read a poem
Mhm.
during a presentation to a class, and a student got up and read me their poem. And in one case, a young Syrian refugee girl
Mm.
who was extremely homesick got up and recited a very long poem that she had written, rhymed and metered, about her homesickness. And she recited it from memory rather than reading it
Oof.
spontaneously.
Wow.
And that was because by me reading my poem, they felt invited to read theirs.
Mhm.
Now, one of the young men who did this, a high school student who read me his poem, did it in front of all his classmates. And later the teacher told me I didn't know that boy could read.
Mm. Oh.
So
Yes.
let's not underestimate each other.
Mhm.
We all
Mhm.
have one. We may all have wonderful poems inside of us.
Mhm. Yeah, I've given the space, right, to recite or to bring it forth. I did a series of workshops this summer with some youth in Virginia, and we ended with poetry slams. We worked on poems, and then the first day we did it over a course of 2 days, but the first day people were a little bit shy. But then by the second day, the line to read their poems was so long, and it felt so validating, and it felt
Well,
freeing.
I think it's a tradition in Latin America.
Mm,
I know it's tradition in Latin America to recite poetry, to declaim poetry,
declamar.
declamar,
Yes.
powerfully and with gestures and dramatically. Uh, so I think that the poetry out loud movement here in the US
Mhm,
is spreading that kind of, courageous declamation of
mhm,
poetry too. There's more and more uh, spoken word poetry, which does not happen to be what I do, but I admire it and love it. And I
mhm,
think that it's exciting what's happening with poetry.
mhm.
It offers so much freedom.
Yeah. And it evolves as we are evolving, right? And
It really does. Yeah, people who 10 years ago might have thought that a verse novel would never win a big award,
Mhm,
have seen Jacqueline Woodson and Kwame Alexander and uh,
mhm,
so many people, Jason Reynolds winning wonderful awards with their
mhm.
verse novels. It's just Elizabeth Acevedo. It could go on and on. You.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, I'm trying. You were one of my maestras for sure. I was studying your work very intensely before I read, and Andrea Davis Pinkney. I read The Red Pencil, and when I read
Gracias.
that, I went, "Wow, that's the thing. I'm a poet. I can do this, and I'm a storyteller, and I can do this." So it was a very natural uh, coming together, but I had to have my maestras. I also read Autobiography of Red, um, by Anne Carson many years ago, and that also kind of like planted the seed of what a novel in verse could be for me, and certainly. Uh, so what advice can you offer anyone who is wanting to write a novel in verse?
Um, I would say to write poems, you know, read a lot and then write individual poems first for practice. The one thing I would warn them not to do is to write prose and then just insert line breaks.
Mhm.
That's not a poem.
That's right.
That doesn't have music. It
Mm,
doesn't have rhythm. It's just prose with line breaks. Don't uh, don't think of poetry as being a prose page where you broke the lines up to make them shorter. That I don't think that um, is a good starting point. I think it will actually interfere with learning how to set yourself free to find the music of language that's needed for poetry.
mhm. Wow. Okay. Well, we're at like 15 minutes. We've got 15 minutes, and we have a few questions in the chat. If I can address them to you, is that okay?
Sure,
All
thanks.
right. All right. So we have one. How do you do your research for your historical fiction?
For the historical fiction, what I like to do, I don't know if you can see behind me, I have a lot of old books from Cuba and about Cuba. And of course, I use interlibrary loan a lot too. I think it's a myth that you can find anything you want on the internet. Not everything is digitized. A lot is, but not everything is. So I still treasure the old paper books. When you're
Mhm,
doing historical research, you want to read everything about your topic that's been written recently, but you also want to read anything that was written at the time when it was actually happening by the people that it happened to. Now, how do you find those first person narratives? How do you find the diaries and the letters? And, where an ordinary farmer or, the farmer's wife or child wrote something about what it felt like to live in that time and place. Or they may not have been literate, but they were interviewed and somebody else wrote it down. How do you find those? You take those new books and read them, and then read everything in the back.
Yeah, yes.
The bibliographies, just one at a time, systematically go through the bibliographies of older and older and older books until you eventually find the first person narratives.
Yes.
Yeah, I would caution people to be very careful about what you believe of what was written. Who wrote it and why? When you read the things like when I wrote one book, Hurricane Dancers, set at the time of the conquest of Cuba by Spain. When you read the things that the conquistadores themselves wrote, they were writing travel grants. They were trying to get more money from the Queen to go on more expeditions and conquer more people and cause more destruction.
Right.
So you have to read what they wrote very carefully. Many of the things they said about the people they encountered were not true. They were trying to make their lives sound really dangerous so that they'd have lots of money to buy more weapons. Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, so many things were written from strictly a white male perspective over the centuries.
Right.
This Rima's Rebellion is about the suffragists in Cuba 100 years ago who were struggling for the right to vote. And everything was controlled by men. And so not even, you didn't even have to, look at, when I said white men, not just white men were doing the writing. And so women were being left out of history. And many of my books have been written for the specific purpose of bringing women who did amazing things back into history. In general, the people who've been left out of history books that are used in the United States in classrooms, the people who've been left out are usually people of color and women.
That's right. Yeah. And that's what's been so powerful about your books. And my book, A Seed in the Sun, my first historical fiction novel, I same thing. I said, I'm going to write about the children and the women because we can't find information on them in the wild as much. Okay, so you know what? We now have two video questions from a wonderful classroom in Petaluma. And so let us play these videos and then you can answer the questions. Okay.
¿Quién o qué te inspiró a escribir este libro?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Mis memorias. Ese libro es un libro de mis memorias y me inspiró mi abuela. Mi abuela me dijo que sería lo último tener una poeta en la familia. My grandmother told me it would be the ultimate to have a poet in the family. And I wrote my memories, this first memoir, but thinking of her, but also I wanted to have it down on paper for my own children and grandchildren and anybody else who might want to read it in the future to know what it was like at that time. I actually I wrote this right after I had taken my daughter to Cuba with me. And we would walk around my mother's hometown and I'd point out that this happened here and this happened there. And, she knew her great grandmother, and I would say, and this is where Fefa did such and such, and she'd say, my daughter finally turned to me and said, I'm not going to remember all this, write it down. That did turn into this book. So I was writing both for my grandmother, for the ancestor, and for my daughter at that time.
Gorgeous, gorgeous. All right. Okay, so now we have a second question from another student from the same classroom.
Hola Margarita, Engle, mi nombre es Luca y tengo una pregunta para ti. Si pudieras resumir todos los eventos de tu infancia, como nos lo contaste en tu libro Aire Encantado, en tan solo 5 palabras, ¿qué 5 palabras serían y por qué?
Una pregunta difícil. 5 palabras. Voy a pensarlo, 5 palabras. Bueno, sería las emociones de la vida. Esas son 5, ¿no? Las emociones de la vida.
Yes.
Gracias.
That's a wonderful, beautiful, beautiful question. That's difficult. I mean, marketing people are always telling us to come up like that. But as a poet, it's a beautiful challenge, right?
The emotions of life. And it's also, it's also about a sense of belonging, seeking a sense of belonging. So, but it's really, poetry for me is all about the emotions.
Yeah, it has been. As it has been an incredible experience to be here and share this space and hear your wisdom. So many students, so many people. You're my maestra. I'm just gonna show you a stack of, I don't know if you can see them, a stack of my books. Well, you can't see them because of the blur, but these are my books. My newest book is Ultraviolet. It comes out in April. It's I guess all of the novels that I've written are in verse, and I owe a huge tribute to you, Maestra Margarita Engle, because you paved the way for so many of us and have been so gracious as a maestra and continue to give and give and give the world so much beauty.
Gracias, thank you. I love your poetry, so I really look forward to reading the new one.
Thank you. Are there any last parting words that you'd like to share with readers out in the world?
Just happy reading. Enjoy it. Yes, enjoy reading.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody out there, for attending the 2023 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. It's been an honor. And look at Margarita Engle's books. Look at my books, too, while you're at it. And all the different authors. We are stronger together. And when we can lift one another, es bello, es bello. Adelante, mi gente, and we'll see you next time.
Muchas gracias.